The sky above the Bitterroot Range had no business turning that color at 4 in the afternoon. Rafferty Holloway stood in the yard of Stone Creek Ranch with an axe in his gloved hand and a half-split log at his feet, and he watched the heavens bruise themselves purple the way a man's knuckles do after a long fight. He had seen that color twice before in his 39 years on this earth. The first time was the evening before Antietam, when a Maryland sky had turned the exact same shade of violet over a cornfield that would swallow 3,000 boys whole before the sun came up again. The second time was the night before his wife Charlotte had died in childbirth 10 years ago, this coming February, right here in the bedroom behind him, her hand in his and the midwife's voice growing quieter and quieter until there was nothing left to say. A sky like that meant the world was about to change, and not for the better. Rafferty let the axe head sink into the chopping block. His breath came out in white columns that the wind tore away before they could rise. Somewhere down the valley, a lone crow called once and then fell silent, and even the mules in the lean-to stopped their chewing to listen. The whole mountain had gone still, the way a deer goes still when it smells a wolf. He thought of Charlotte then without meaning to. He thought of the way she used to stand on this very porch with her apron tied over her belly, watching weather come in from the west, saying that God sent storms the way a man sends a letter. And it was the job of those who received them to sit quiet and read. He had loved her more than he knew how to say, and when she died, he had stopped reading altogether. He had stopped listening to whatever God had to tell him. He had stopped believing there was anyone on the other end of the line. But standing there now with that purple bruise spreading over the peaks and the air gone quiet as a prayer, Rafferty Holloway felt something he had not felt in 10 years. He felt a whisper at the back of his neck, and the whisper said, "Someone is out there. Someone needs you." He did not know yet that the whisper was telling the truth. He only knew that the storm was coming and he had work to do. Inside the ranch house, the smell of cornbread and coffee wrapped around Rafferty like an old coat as he pushed through the door with an armload of split pine. Tobias Kincaid, 30 years old and built like a fence post with shoulders on it, stood at the cast iron stove turning a skillet with the patient attention of a man who had learned to cook because nobody else would. Nathaniel Boone, the youngest at 24, sat at the long pine table with the ranch ledger open in front of him, a pencil behind one ear, and his boots hooked on the rung of his chair. "You keep bringing in that much wood. Raff and folks will start to think we're expecting the devil himself for supper," Toby said without turning from the skillet. "Maybe we are," Rafferty said. Something in his voice made both younger men look up. Nate set the pencil down. "What did you see out there?" "Sky's gone the wrong color. Wind's wrong too. This isn't going to be a dusting, boys. This is the kind that kills people who don't know how to get out of its way." Toby wiped his hands on a rag and set the skillet off the heat. "How long?" 2 hours, maybe less." Nate was already on his feet reaching for his coat. "I'll check the chicken coop and bring the yearlings in from the south pasture." "I'll seat the windows," Toby said. "Raff, you want me to ride out and check the line fence before it comes?" Rafferty thought about it for a moment. He thought about letting Toby go because Toby was young and strong and could cover ground faster than he could. He thought about sitting down at the table and letting the cornbread fill his stomach and the coffee warm his hands, and waiting out the storm in the company of the only family he had left in this world. And then he thought about that whisper. "No," he said, "I'll go myself. There's a stretch up by the north gate where I set a couple of wolf traps last week. If snow covers the plates, any animal that wanders through there tonight is going to lose a leg. I can't have that on my conscience." Toby watched him carefully. "You sure, Raff?" "I'm sure." "Then take the rope." Rafferty nodded. The rope was a thing they had all agreed on after a cattleman over in Deer Lodge County had frozen to death 2 winters back 10 feet from his own front door because he had walked out into a whiteout without a tether and lost his direction between the porch and the barn. Out here, a man could die of a mistake that small. The rope was the difference between a mistake and a grave. He tied one end around the newel post of the porch and the other end through a loop on his belt. He pulled his buffalo hide coat up to his ears. He took his Winchester down from its peg above the door, not because he expected to use it, but because a man in Montana did not walk into a storm without a rifle, any more than he walked into a church without removing his hat. Some things were simply done. Before he stepped off the porch, Nate put a hand on his sleeve. "Be careful out there, Raff." Rafferty looked down at the boy he had raised from 14 years old, the boy whose father had been killed by bank robbers in a Kansas street and who had walked the whole way to Montana alone with nothing but a rolled-up blanket and a letter of introduction written in pencil. He put his own hand over Nate's for a brief second. "I always am, son." Then he stepped into the storm, and the storm swallowed him. 3 weeks earlier, in 1,800 miles to the east, a young woman named Ophelia Pembroke had knelt on the bedroom floor of a narrow row house on Chestnut Street in Philadelphia and put the last of her earthly possessions into a leather trunk that had once belonged to her grandmother. 3 dresses, a comb made of tortoiseshell with 3 teeth missing, a small daguerreotype of her parents on their wedding day taken when her mother was 19 and her father was 22, both of them unsmiling and solemn, the way people were in pictures back then, because they did not know they were allowed to look happy. A sewing kit of bone needles and thread in every color. $17.40 in a knotted handkerchief. And the Pembroke family Bible bound in black leather with the names of her dead written in a spidery hand on the flyleaf going all the way back to 1793. That was everything she owned in the world. Ophelia was 21 years old. She had hair the color of dark honey and eyes the gray of storm water. And if a man had passed her on the street in Philadelphia and given her a second look, he would have said she was pretty in a quiet way, the way a hymn is pretty when you hear it through the open door of a church. But no man had ever looked at her that way because Ophelia had spent most of her life invisible. Her parents had died of cholera when she was 15. Her aunt had taken her in the way a farmer takes in a stray cat, which is to say grudgingly, and had worked her like a servant for 6 years before dying herself and leaving nothing behind but a sold house and a stack of unpaid bills. That was when the letters had come. Ophelia had answered an advertisement in the matrimonial column of the Matrimonial Herald because a woman who worked beside her at the seamstress shop had sworn it was how her own sister had found a decent husband out in the Colorado territory. The advertisement had said, "Christian gentleman of good standing, proprietor of a prosperous ranch at the foot of the Bitterroot Mountains, Montana territory, seeks a young wife of Quaker or similar faith to share a simple life under God. Travel paid. Write to E. Meriwether, Silver City, Montana territory." The letters that came back were beautiful. They spoke of wheat fields under a big sky. They spoke of a small white chapel with a bell that rang on Sunday mornings. They spoke of Proverbs 31 and the virtuous woman whose price was far above rubies, and they were signed in a sloping hand that looked to Ophelia like the hand of a man who had read his Bible every night since he was a boy. She had read those letters by candle in her aunt's cold attic room, and she had pressed them to her chest, and she had believed with the whole of her heart that the God her mother had taught her about was finally answering a prayer she had been praying since she was 15 years old. That prayer was simply this: "Please send me someone who will not leave me alone." And so she had boarded a train. On the 4th night out of Philadelphia, somewhere in the Dakota country, where the prairie rolled on in the dark like the back of a sleeping animal, Ophelia sat in a coach car with her trunk at her feet and her Bible in her lap, and a woman in a black morning dress sat down across from her. The woman introduced herself as Abigail Thornton, the widow of a silver miner out of Butte. She had a kind face and tired eyes, and when Ophelia, in the polite way young women had of filling silences, mentioned that she was traveling to Silver City to be married to a Mr. Ezekiel Meriwether, the kindness in Abigail Thornton's face drained out of it the way water drains out of a broken cup. The older woman did not speak for a long time. The wheels of the train clacked under them. Somewhere in another kind a baby cried and was hushed. Finally, Abigail Thornton reached across the aisle and took Ophelia's hand in both of her own. "Child," she said, and her voice was barely above a whisper, "do you pray often?" "Yes, ma'am, every night." "Then you'll want to pray more. You'll want to pray more than you ever have in your life where you are going." Ophelia's mouth went dry. "Ma'am, what do you mean?" But Abigail Thornton was already shaking her head and looking away as if she had said too much or not enough and could not decide which. "I cannot tell you. I cannot say the things I know. But I will pray for you every night myself, child. I will pray every single night until I hear that you are safe." At the next stop, the widow stood up and walked off into the dark platform and disappeared, and Ophelia was left alone in her seat with her Bible pressed against her ribs and her heart beating against the cover of the book as if it were trying to get inside for shelter. She could not turn back. She did not have the money. She did not have the home. She closed her eyes and she began to pray. The stagecoach from Helena to Miller's Crossing took 2 more days, and when Ophelia finally stepped down from it into the thin gray light of that November afternoon, the wind was already carrying the first flecks of snow. Miller's Crossing was not a town. It was a post with a lean-to beside it and a single weather-beaten sign that said simply "Crossing." The stagecoach driver unloaded her trunk and tipped his hat and climbed back up on the box and was gone inside of 3 minutes. For a little while, Ophelia stood there alone with the empty plain on one side of her and the pine-covered slope of the mountain on the other, and she thought perhaps this was a test of her patience, nothing more. The letters had promised that Mr. Merriweather would meet her. She would wait. She did not have to wait long. A rider came up the trail from the south at a walking pace, and as he approached, Ophelia's first thought was that he did not look like a man who had written those letters. He was tall and whip-thin, with a black mustache and eyes the color of a river bottom. His coat was good leather, but it had not been cleaned in a long time, and the spurs on his boots were silver with star-shaped rowel that caught the gray light. He drew up his horse in front of her and touched the brim of his hat without smiling. "Miss Pembroke." "Yes, yes, that is me." Her heart leapt up into her throat. "Are you Mr. Merriweather?" "No, ma'am, name's Cormac Driscoll. Mr. Merriweather sent me to fetch you on account of he's laid up with a cold today and didn't want to risk the weather." He made a small, apologetic gesture. "He sends his deepest apologies and his warmest welcome." Ophelia felt the tension in her shoulders loosen a little. A cold. Of course. That was a reasonable thing. "Oh, I am sorry to hear he is unwell. Should we make haste?" "Soon enough, ma'am. First, I need to ask you a question or two, if you'll permit it." "Of course." "Mr. Merriweather asked me to inquire respectful-like about the matter of your dowry." Driscoll's voice was perfectly polite, but there was something in his eyes that made Ophelia want to take a step back. "The letters had given him to understand that you were a young woman of some means. He wants to know what arrangements have been made so he can plan the wedding accordingly." Ophelia felt her cheeks go hot, and then cold, and then hot again. "Mr. Driscoll, I wrote in my very first letter that my aunt had left me nothing. I wrote of my circumstances plainly. Mr. Merriweather answered that my heart and my faith were more valuable to him than any sum of gold. I have $17 to my name, and everything else I own is in that trunk there. I am sorry if there has been some misunderstanding." Something happened to Cormac Driscoll's face then. It happened very slowly, the way ice forms on a pond, and it was terrible to see. The politeness went first, then the pretense of warmth. And what was left underneath when both those things were gone was the face of a man who had done things to people for money and had stopped feeling bad about it a long time ago. "I see," he said quietly. "I see. Well, that does change the arrangements." "I do not understand." "No, ma'am, you don't." He glanced up at the sky as if checking something against it. "Mr. Merriweather keeps a smaller property for cases like yours. Modest accommodations. More fitting for a bride of humble means. It is a mile up that trail right there." He pointed to a narrow path that climbed into the pines and disappeared into the gathering dark. "I'll ride ahead and let him know you are coming. You follow on foot? It is just the 1 mile. "On foot, but my trunk." "I'll send a boy down for the trunk tomorrow." 1 mile is nothing, ma'am. A pleasant walk for a young woman of your vigor." He did not wait for her to answer. He touched his hat one more time. He turned his horse. He rode away up the trail at a clean, easy trot. And he did not look back once, not even when Ophelia called out after him. And within 2 minutes, he was gone into the trees, and she was standing alone at Miller's Crossing, with a trunk at her feet and the first real snow beginning to fall. It took her a long moment to understand that she had been left. And then it took her another long moment to understand that the trail he had pointed to did not look like the kind of trail that led to any kind of house at all. She had no choice but to walk it. The first mile was not so bad. The trail climbed gently through the pines, and Ophelia walked with her Bible clutched to her chest and her head down against the wind, and she told herself that Mr. Driscoll had simply been rude, that the ranch was real, that Mr. Merriweather was waiting for her with a fire and a warm bowl of something and an explanation that would make sense of all this. She told herself that God did not answer a prayer with a trick. In the second mile, the snow began to fall in earnest, and the wind came down off the mountain with teeth in it, and her thin wool coat, which had served her perfectly well on the streets of Philadelphia, began to feel like a layer of paper pressed against her skin. Her leather shoes, which had been meant for parlors and sidewalks, began to soak through. The first joints of her toes started to burn, and then to numb, and then to disappear altogether. In the third mile, the trail narrowed and the trees closed in around it, and the light began to fail. And Ophelia understood the way a drowning person understands the shape of the shore, that there was no ranch at the end of this path. There was no small white chapel. There was no bell that rang on Sunday mornings. There was no Mr. Merriweather waiting by a fire. There was only the storm. She fell to her knees in the snow. The cold came up through the fabric of her dress, and she gasped at the shock of it. And for a moment, she thought she might simply stay there, because the effort of standing up again was more than she could imagine. The Bible slipped from her numb fingers and dropped into the powder, and she looked at it lying there, black leather against white, and she thought of her mother, and she thought of the fly-leaf with all those names written in the spidery hand, and she thought, I am going to be the last name in that book, and no one will ever write it. And then she heard her mother's voice. She heard it as clearly as if her mother were standing behind her in the storm. She heard it say, Ophelia, get up, 3 more steps. That is all, 3 more steps. She did not know if it was an angel or a ghost, or the last flare of a dying mind. She did not care. She picked up the Bible. She pressed it back against her ribs where it belonged. She got her feet under her, and she stood up. 3 steps, then 3 more, then 3 more. The wind had become a thing that hit her in the chest and tried to push her backwards down the mountain. The snow was past her knees in places. She could not feel her feet, and she could not feel her hands, and the cold had stopped hurting, which she dimly understood was the worst sign of all. But she kept walking because her mother had told her to, because that black leather Bible was pressed against her heart, and her mother's spidery handwriting was on the flyleaf. And her mother was praying for her somehow from wherever it was her mother had gone when the cholera took her 6 years ago. And then she fell one more time beside a great dark boulder that rose out of the snow like the shoulder of a buried giant, and this time her legs would not answer her. She curled her body around the Bible. She closed her eyes. She said, Lord, if you can hear me, please do not let me die alone out here. Please send someone. Please. Then the cold took her, and she did not know anything else. Rafferty Holloway had turned for home. He had checked the wolf traps and sprung the one that needed springing, and he had worked his way along the line fence for about 400 yards with the storm building around him, and when the visibility dropped to the length of his outstretched arm, he had decided that was enough for any man. He followed the tether rope back through the whiteout one hand at a time, and he was maybe 300 feet from his own front porch when something caught at the edge of his vision and made him stop. A patch of color that did not belong. The world around him was white and gray and the black of tree trunks. But down the slope from the trail, maybe 20 yards off, there was a small spot of faded blue. The blue of a coat that had been blue once before many washings. Rafferty stood very still. The wind shifted, and for half a second the blowing snow parted, and in that half second he saw the shape of her clearly. A young woman, curled on her side at the base of a boulder, half buried already, one arm pressed against her chest. He did not think. He let the tether rope run out behind him, and he waded down the slope with the snow hissing around his boots and his heart hammering in a way he had not felt since the war. He dropped to his knees beside her. He rolled her onto her back with hands that were careful even in their hurry, because a decade of being a husband had taught Rafferty Holloway how to touch a woman as if she were made of something precious. And that lesson had never left him, even though the wife who taught it to him had. Her skin was the color of skim milk. Her lips were a blue so dark it was almost black. Her hair was the color of dark honey under the rime of ice that had formed in it. And her right hand was locked around a small black leather book so tightly that her knuckles had gone translucent the way a candle flame looks when it burns down near the wick. Rafferty pulled off his right glove with his teeth, and he pressed two rough fingers to the hollow of her throat. Nothing. He waited. He waited, and the wind screamed around them, and he waited some more, and he thought, there it is. There it is, Lord, another one you couldn't be bothered to save. And then under his fingertips, a single slow beat. Just one. He held his breath. He counted. He had counted pulses before on the fields of Maryland when he was a boy carrying water to wounded men, and he knew how long to wait before you gave up. Another beat, weaker. She was still in there. Barely, but she was still in there. Rafferty Holloway, who had not spoken to God in 10 years, found himself kneeling in the snow beside a dying stranger, and he heard words come out of his own mouth that he had not planned to say. Lord, I know I do not have the right. I walked away from you the night you took Charlotte, and I have not once looked back. I have nothing to offer you and no claim on you at all. But I am asking for this one thing, and if you give me this one thing, I will not ask you for another thing as long as I live. Do not take this one, not this one, not today, not like this. The wind took his words and carried them away up into the storm, and Rafferty did not know if anyone had heard them. But he took off his buffalo hide coat, the heavy one that had been his father's before him, and he wrapped it around the woman on the ground, and he lifted her up against his chest, and he started back up the slope toward the tether rope and the ranch beyond it. She weighed almost nothing at all. She weighed less than a child. He could feel the brittle bird weight of her through the layers of the coat, and he could feel the Bible still pressed between them, because her frozen hand had not let go of it even in her unconsciousness. That, more than anything else, was what undid him. That a woman dying alone in a Montana blizzard had refused to release the one thing she loved. He had known men in the war who let go of everything at the end. He had never known one who held on like that. He found the tether rope. He wrapped his free hand around it. He put one snowshoe in front of the other. The wind shoved him sideways. He went down on one knee and stood back up. He kept walking. Twice more the storm put him on the ground, and twice more he got up, and each time he held her tighter against his chest so that whatever warmth remained in his body would pass through the buffalo hide and into her. He whispered to her as he walked, not because he thought she could hear him, but because his own voice was the only thing in the world that was not the storm. Stay with me, ma'am. Stay with me that a little longer. I don't know who you are. I don't know where you came from. But God put me in your path for a reason, and I am not letting you go on my watch. You hear me? You hold on. You hold on. When his boots finally hit the wooden planks of his porch, he kicked the door so hard the frame shook, and Toby and Nate were there in an instant, and Rafferty staggered inside, and the warmth of the house hit him like a wall, and he nearly went down to his knees from the suddenness of it. God Almighty, Toby breathed, seeing what he carried. Get the bearskin rug in front of the stove, not too close. Nate, boil water and find me every wool blanket in this house. Move. They moved. For the rest of that night, the three men of Stone Creek Ranch played tug-of-war with death over the body of a woman whose name they did not yet know. Toby, who had once helped a neighbor nurse a whole family through the cholera of '84, was the one who kept them from killing her with kindness. Slow, he said over and over. Slow, slow. Warm the blankets first, but not too hot. Rub her hands through the wool. Don't touch the skin directly yet. If we warm her too fast, her heart will stop. Do you hear me, Raph Slow? Nate kept the stove fed and the water moving, and at one point he fetched down an old sheepskin that had belonged to Rafferty's mother and laid it under her for extra insulation. Rafferty did the part that only a man who had been a husband could do. With the skinning knife he carried, and with eyes that did not linger for even a fraction of a second, he cut away the frozen ruin of her coat and dress, and he left her in the dry woolen undergarments beneath. And then he wrapped her in 5 layers of warmed blanket, the way a mother swaddles an infant. He never looked at her body except as a problem to be solved. Charlotte had taught him that. A woman was not a thing to be seen. A woman was a soul to be tended. They worked through the small hours. The wind screamed against the log walls. The cast iron stove glowed orange in the darkened room. Around midnight, her color began to change, and the fever came on, and she began to moan. It was a sound like grief and relief mixed together, the sound a person makes when the nerves come back and the pain comes with them. Her eyes fluttered but didn't open. She started to whisper. Her whispers were fragments at first, and none of them made sense. The trail, only a mile, my mother, the Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. Nate, who knew his Bible, because the schoolmaster in Helena had made him learn it, looked up sharply. That's the 23rd Psalm, Raff. She's praying. Rafferty looked down at the woman on the bearskin rug and felt something shift in his chest that he did not have a name for. He reached over to the small table by the stove where he had laid the black leather Bible when he first brought her in. He picked it up carefully, the way a man picks up a thing that belongs to someone else, and he placed it gently on her chest under her hands where it had been when he found her. Her fingers closed around it at once, even in her unconsciousness, and her breathing steadied. Rafferty Holloway sat back on his heels and looked at his 2 brothers, and none of them said a word. Around the darkest hour of the night, when even the wind had grown tired, and the storm outside had settled into a long, steady moan, Rafferty was sitting alone beside her with a cool, damp cloth in his hand, pressing it against her forehead to bring the fever down. Toby had gone to lie down for an hour. Nate was asleep in the chair by the door, his chin on his chest. Without ironing her eyes open, they were the clearest gray he had ever seen, the color of morning after a long rain, and they looked directly into his with a strange, impossible focus, as if she had been waiting her whole life to look at him, and now that she was doing it, she did not intend to waste a single second. "My mother," she whispered. Her voice was hoarse and thin, but it was perfectly clear. "My mother prayed for a man with eyes like yours to come and find me. You are him. I knew you by my heart before I ever saw you with my eyes." Then her eyes closed again, and she was gone back into the fever. Rafferty Holloway sat very still on the bearskin rug beside her. The cloth was forgotten in his hand. The stove hissed softly behind him. And for the first time in 10 years, something in the stone wall he had built around his own heart gave way, and a hairline crack opened in it, and a little warmth started to come through. He did not know what to call what he was feeling. He had not felt it in so long that he had forgotten it had a name. He only knew that he had made a promise in the snow out there beside the boulder that he would not let her go. And he knew, sitting there in the dark with her Bible rising and falling on her chest with each fragile breath, that the promise he had made had just become something bigger. It had become an oath. And a man of Stone Creek Ranch did not break an oath. Not ever. Not even when it cost him everything. She slept the rest of that long night, and the storm outside slept with her. By mid-morning of the next day, the storm had broken. The whole of the gulch lay under 3 feet of fresh powder, and the sun came up over the Bitterroots and turned the snowfield into a glare so bright it hurt to look at. Rafferty sat at the pine table cleaning his Winchester out of long habit while he watched her, and at 10:15 her breathing changed, and a few minutes after that her eyes opened for the second time, and this time they stayed open. She took in the low-beam ceiling. She took in the dried herbs hanging from the rafters. She took in the stove, and the bearskin rug, and the wool blankets she was wrapped in, and the oversized flannel shirt she realized she was wearing. Her eyes moved to the 3 men in the room, Toby by the window, Nate at the water basin, and Rafferty at the table with the rifle in his hands, and her face went pale with a terror so complete that Rafferty set the rifle down at once and raised his hands the way a man raises his hands to a frightened animal. "Easy now, ma'am, easy. You're safe. I give you my word you are safe." She tried to speak and could not. Her throat was too raw. Nate brought her a tin cup of warm broth and held it while she sipped. "My name is Rafferty Holloway," Rafferty said, keeping his voice low and even. "This is my ranch, Stone Creek Ranch, up near a place called Dead Man's Gulch. These are my brothers, Tobias Kincaid and Nathaniel Boone. We are the only three people on this mountain. I found you yesterday afternoon in the blizzard beside a boulder about 300 yards from this front door. You were dying. I brought you inside. We have been trying to keep you in the world ever since." He watched her carefully as she took that in. "I had to cut away your dress, ma'am. It was frozen solid and it would have killed you. I did not look. I want you to hear that from me. I did not look once. I have been a husband in my life, and I know how a man treats a woman. You have my word on that before God." She swallowed. Her eyes filled. "Thank you, Mr. Holloway. May I ask your name?" "Ophelia," she said. "Ophelia Pembroke. I came from Philadelphia." "And how did a young woman from Philadelphia come to be dying in a snowdrift on my mountain, Miss Pembroke?" And so in a voice that shook, and with the Bible still clutched against her chest under the blankets, Ophelia Pembroke told them. She told them about the matrimonial advertisement. She told them about the letters about the Proverbs 31 and the small white chapel and the Christian gentleman who had signed his name, E. Merriweather. She told them about her aunt and the $17 and the long train ride and the woman in the morning dress who had whispered to her to pray harder than she ever had in her life. She told them about Cormac Driscoll and the silver star-shaped spurs and the way his politeness had drained out of his face like water out of a broken cup when she had said she had no dowry. She told them about being pointed up a trail that did not lead to any ranch at all. She told them about the 3 miles, about her mother's voice telling her to take 3 more steps, about falling at last beside the boulder and praying for someone to come. As she spoke, the faces of the 3 men at Stone Creek Ranch went through a series of changes that Ophelia Pembroke would remember for the rest of her life. Toby Kincaid's jaw went tight. His fist closed slowly on the edge of the table, and at one point he said a word under his breath that was not the kind of word a man said in front of a lady, and then he flushed and apologized. Nate Boone went as white as the snow outside because Nate had known men like Cormac Driscoll back in Kansas, and he knew what star-shaped spurs meant out here. He looked over at Rafferty with eyes that said, "Please tell her. Please." Rafferty Holloway listened the whole way through without interrupting. Only when she reached the part about the boulder did a single muscle feather in his jaw, and only his brothers knew him well enough to see it. When Ophelia was done, the cabin was very quiet. Rafferty stood up from the table. He walked slowly over to the bearskin rug where she lay, and he knelt down beside her so that their eyes were level. He did not take her hand because he knew he did not have the right, but his voice when he spoke was the gentlest she had ever heard from a man. "Miss Pembroke, I need you to hear me now, and I need you to hear me clearly, because what I am about to say is a hard thing and a true thing, and you deserve both. There is no ranch at the end of that trail. There never was. Ezekiel Merriweather does not own a single head of cattle. He owns 3 saloons in Silver City and a gambling hall, and he runs the whole rotten underside of this territory. The women who work in his establishments did not go there willingly. He preys on women like you, women without family, women who would not be missed, women with faith in their hearts and no one to protect them. He did not abandon you at Miller's Crossing. That was not abandonment. That was murder. He sent Cormac Driscoll, who has killed more men than either of my brothers is old, and he pointed you up a trail in the dying light of a November afternoon with a blizzard coming down the mountain, and he left you to freeze. It was cheaper and cleaner than using a bullet. He was letting the mountain do his killing for him." Ophelia Pembroke began to weep. She wept silently at first the way a person weeps when they have been taught all their life that tears are a private thing. Then as the full weight of what she had just been told settled onto her, the tears became something harder. She pressed the Bible against her face and her shoulders shook, and the sound she made was the sound of every prayer she had ever prayed breaking in half inside her. "I was a fool," she whispered into the leather. "I believed every word. I thought God was sending me somewhere. I thought—" "Miss Pembroke." Rafferty waited until she looked up. When she did, his eyes had changed. They were still hard. They would always be hard because the war and the death of his wife had written themselves into the bones of his face, and they were not going away. But there was something else in them now, something that had not been there yesterday morning when he had stood in the yard watching a purple sky come in over the mountains. "You are not a fool," he said. "A fool is a person who knows better and chooses wrong. You are a woman of faith who was preyed upon by a wicked man. There is a world of difference between those two things, and I will not have you confusing them under my roof. And as long as you are under my roof, Miss Pembroke, you are under my protection. That is not a polite thing I am saying to comfort you. That is an oath, and out here in this country, an oath from a man of Stone Creek is not a thing that breaks. I made a promise in the snow yesterday when I was kneeling beside you, and I thought you were dying. I promised that if God let me bring you in alive, I would not let any harm come to you again while I drew breath. I meant that promise. I am telling you now that I meant it." Behind him, Toby took a step forward and set his big weathered hand on the back of Rafferty's shoulder. "His oath is our oath, ma'am." Nate nodded once solemnly. "Berthier, OMA. That is how it works here." Ophelia Pembroke looked at the three men standing around her. These three strangers who 12 hours ago had not known her shame, and something inside her, something that had been cold and locked shut since her parents died 6 years ago, began very slowly to thaw. It was not love yet. It was not even trust yet. It was only the first whisper of the thing that comes before those things. It was the moment when a person who has been alone their whole life looks up and realizes with a shock that goes all the way down to the bone that they are not alone anymore. She whispered thank you, and then she could not say anything else, and Rafferty, understanding, stood up and gave her the mercy of privacy. He walked to the door and pulled on his coat and said to his brothers without turning around, "I am going back out to the boulder. I want to see if I can salvage her trunk before the wind buries it any deeper." Toby glanced at him. "You sure the snow's waist deep out there now?" "I am sure." The truth was, Rafferty needed the air. He needed to stand outside for a few minutes and breathe the cold and feel the mountain around him, because the thing that had happened inside the cabin just now was too big to sit with all at once. A woman had told him she had known him by her heart before she saw him with her eyes, and he had sworn an oath over her to a God he had not spoken to in a decade, and both of those things had reorganized something fundamental inside his chest, and he needed a few minutes to figure out how to carry them. He strapped on his snowshoes. He took the Winchester. He retraced his steps of the day before following the half-buried trail of his own passage, and after about a quarter of an hour he came to the great dark boulder where he had found her. The trunk was still there, mostly buried on its side against the base of the rock. Rafferty bent to start brushing the snow off it, and that was when his eyes, which were trained by 20 years of tracking to notice what did not belong, caught something on the leeward side of the boulder that made his whole body go still. Boot prints, not sweeping drifts, not wind shapes. Deep cylindrical holes punched through the hard crust, sheltered from the worst of the wind by the shoulder of the rock. They had been made the day before, probably within an hour of when he had first found Ophelia lying there. Rafferty knelt down and brushed the powder away with the back of his glove, and the outline came up clean and sharp underneath, a heavy riding boot. And on the heel, pressed deep into the frozen ground, the unmistakable gouge of a spur rowel shaped like a star. He studied the angle of the tracks. Whoever had made them had come up the valley trail from the direction of Miller's Crossing. He had walked right up behind this boulder, and he had stood here in this exact spot for what looked like a long while. Then he had turned around and gone back down the mountain. Rafferty's mind put it together in pieces the way a mind does when it is looking at something it does not want to see. Ophelia had said that Cormac Driscoll had ridden away from her at Miller's Crossing. She had said that plainly, but these tracks said something else. These tracks said that Driscoll had not ridden away at all, or that he had ridden a little ways away and then circled back on foot. He had followed her up this trail at a distance in the gathering storm. He had watched her fall here beside this boulder. He had stood behind this rock out of sight, and he had waited, not lifting a finger, to help her, to make absolutely certain she did not get up again. And when he finally turned and left, it had not been because he was confident she was dying. It had been because Rafferty himself had come out of the cabin into the storm, and Driscoll had heard him coming, and Driscoll had decided to leave before he was seen. Which meant that Cormac Driscoll, at this exact moment, was somewhere down in Silver City, sitting across the table from Ezekiel Merriweather, telling him that the girl from Philadelphia had not died alone in the snow the way she was supposed to. Telling him that the rancher of Stone Creek had come out into a blizzard and carried her inside. Telling him that she was still alive. Rafferty Holloway stood up slowly beside the boulder, with the star-shaped boot print at his feet and his rifle in his hands, and he looked down the long white valley toward Silver City, invisible beyond the ridges, but very real, and he spoke to it in a voice so quiet that only the wind could hear him. "So that is how it is going to be, Merriweather. You sent the devil up my mountain to kill a woman who prayed. Well, you have made yourself a mistake, because the devil you sent did not finish the job, and the woman he was sent to kill is lying in my house right now with her mother's Bible on her chest and my oath over her head. You are going to come for her. I know that. I would come for her too if I were the kind of man you are, because men like you cannot leave a witness walking. So come on then, come up this mountain, bring whatever you have. Bring Driscoll, and bring the rest of your hired dogs, and bring every gun you can buy in Silver City. But when you cross that tree line down there, you are going to be crossing it onto Stone Creek land. And on Stone Creek land, there are 3 brothers and 1 oath, and a woman whose faith I am starting to believe in, even though I spent 10 years telling myself faith was a thing for other men. Come on up, Ezekiel Merriweather. We will be waiting." He slung the trunk strap over his shoulder, and he turned his back on the valley, and he started the long walk home through the snow. And above him the sun cleared the high ridge of the Bitterroots and lit up the whole world in a cold silver light. And somewhere in the trees behind him, a single crow called once and went silent, and Rafferty Holloway did not look back. The morning after Rafferty Holloway came back from the boulder, with the news of the star-shaped boot prints, the 3 men of Stone Creek Ranch sat around the pine table and held the kind of conversation that men hold when they know the world is about to come for them and they cannot yet tell their women. Ophelia was asleep behind the closed door of the small bedroom that Rafferty had given up to her. The fever had finally broken in the small hours. Nate had checked on her twice already that morning, moving on his stockinged feet so as not to disturb her, and each time he had come back to the main room and nodded once to say she was still breathing and still sleeping. Rafferty laid out what he had seen in the snow. He did not raise his voice. Rafferty Holloway almost never raised his voice, and when he did, the men around him knew that blood was about to follow. But this morning his voice was low and steady, the way the voice of a man sounds when he has already stopped being surprised by the wickedness of other men and is only thinking now about what to do about it. Driscoll followed her up the mountain. He watched her fall. He stood behind the boulder and waited on her to die. That is the kind of man we are dealing with. Not a hired gun who takes his money and walks away. A hired gun who stays and watches because he was told to be sure. Which means that when he went back down that mountain, he did not tell Ezekiel Merriweather that he had left her at Miller's Crossing and the storm had taken her. He told him he had walked her up a trail and waited until I came out of the cabin and scared him off. Merriweather knows right now as we sit here that she is alive. He knows she is in this house. And he knows that I know who he is because she will have told me, and he knows I will have believed her. Toby folded his arms on the table. So he is coming. He is coming. When Rafferty looked toward the window where the bright silver glare of the snowfield lay 1.5 feet deep across the yard. Not today, not this week, not even this month if we are lucky. The pass at Horse Prairie is already choked. No rider is getting over that in anything less than 4 feet of snowshoes. And a man on snowshoes cannot carry enough gun to be worth the trip. As long as the snow holds, we have time. The thing we need to watch for is a Chinook, the warm wind. If that comes down off the ridge and eats the pack in a day, the trail opens back up, and we will have riders at our door before we have finished the morning coffee. Nate spoke up quietly from the end of the table. And if we had any sense at all, we would put her in a wagon and take her to Helena ourselves before the Chinook comes. Tell the federal marshal the whole story. Let the law handle Merriweather. I thought of that already, Rafferty said. And the federal marshal in Helena is a good man, but Helena is 3 days from here in good weather, and we do not have good weather. Also, Nate Merriweather owns the sheriff of Silver City. He owns 2 of the 3 judges in the valley. If he decides to file a paper on her, any paper at all, we would not get halfway down the mountain before someone with a badge stopped us and took her off our hands. And once she is off our hands, we will never see her again. He paused. No, she stays here. Here on this land, she is ours to protect. Anywhere else, she is theirs to take. Toby nodded slowly. Then we ford up. We ford up, and we do it carefully so she does not see what we are doing until she is strong enough to carry the knowledge. She has been through the hell of her life in the last 72 hours. She does not need to wake up this morning and be told that a gang of men with guns is going to come up this mountain to finish what Driscoll started. Not yet. Not until she can stand on her own 2 feet without the room tilting. How long do we give her? Rafferty thought about it. 2 weeks. 2 weeks of quiet. 2 weeks of her being allowed to be a person instead of a problem. Then we tell her the rest. We tell her because she deserves to know, and because when the day comes, we will need her to be able to hold a gun herself. Nate's face went still. You think it is going to come to that? I think a woman who walked 3 miles up a Montana trail in a blizzard with nothing but a Bible and her mother's voice in her ear is a woman who knows how to stand her ground. And I think we are going to need her standing when the time comes. He pushed his chair back. He walked to the peg by the door and took down his coat. One more thing, he said with his hand on the latch. As long as she is in this house, there are rules. No one is alone with her except to bring her food or tend her if she calls. No one speaks a word in her hearing that we would not speak in the hearing of our own mother. She sleeps behind a bolted door. There is a pistol on the shelf in her room loaded, and she is to be told where it is the first day she is able to walk. And if any of you even for a moment forget what a woman like her is worth in this country, I will remind you with my own hands. Is that understood? Understood, Toby said. Nate said nothing at all because Nate did not need to be told. Nate had grown up in the houses of other people's families after his father died, and he had seen up close, and before his eyes were old enough to look away, what happened to girls who had no one to speak for them. Whatever code of the West there was in this house, Nate had written half of it himself without anyone noticing. Rafferty opened the door and stepped out into the cold white morning to go and feed the mules, and behind him the 2 younger men sat at the table with their coffee cooling in their cups. Ophelia woke that afternoon to the smell of bread baking and the sound of a man humming. For one slow moment, she could not remember where she was, and then she remembered all of it at once, the boulder and the storm and her mother's voice and the stranger kneeling over her in the snow, and she lay very still under the wool blankets and listened to the humming and tried to understand what she was hearing. It was Toby in the main room. He was humming a slow Texas song that his mother had sung to him before she died, and he was turning a pan of cornbread in the oven of the cast iron stove, and he was doing it with the careful domestic attention of a man who had learned to cook because nobody else would do it for him. He did not know she was awake. He was humming to himself, and he was humming well, and the sound of it was the sound of a home. Ophelia Pembroke closed her eyes again, and she began very quietly to cry. She did not cry because she was sad. She cried because in the narrow attic room on Chestnut Street, where her aunt had kept her for 6 long years, she had not once in all that time heard a man hum. She had not heard a man cook. She had not heard a man speak her name gently or set down a tin cup of broth beside her pillow, or close the door softly so as not to wake her. She had lived in a world in which men were strangers, and the only voices in her life were the voices of unkind women and the voices in her Bible. And now she was lying in a small wooden room on a mountain, 2,000 miles away from Philadelphia, and a Texas cowboy was humming a lullaby over a pan of cornbread, and the tears that came out of her were the kind of tears that a person cries when their heart has been frozen for so long that it does not know what to do with the first thaw. She pulled one of the blankets around her shoulders like a cloak. She opened the door of the small room. Toby turned at the sound. "Miss Pembroke, you're up." "Mr. Kincaid, I think, is that right?" "Toby will do, ma'am. Mr. Kincaid was my father and I never met him." He said it lightly, the way a man says a thing that used to hurt but does not hurt anymore. He set a cloth over the cornbread and came around the stove. "Let me help you to the chair by the window. You should not be standing on those feet yet." He did not touch her. He walked beside her with his hand hovering near her elbow in case she fell, and she thought to herself that this was a man who had been told by someone somewhere how to be careful with a woman who had been hurt. She sat in the wooden chair by the window, and Toby pulled another blanket over her knees, and she looked out through the frosted glass at the yard of Stone Creek Ranch for the first time in daylight. What she saw looked like a painting. 3 feet of untouched snow lay across the yard, sculpted into long blue shadows by the late afternoon sun. A split rail fence ran along the edge of it. A barn and a lean-to and a chicken coop all wore thick white caps of powder. Beyond the fence, a long slope of blue spruce climbed up toward a pass that was lost in a haze of cold light, and beyond the pass, the Bitterroot Range rose up in jagged gray teeth against a pale sky. In the middle of the yard, a man was pitching hay to 2 mules from the door of the lean-to, and even at this distance, Ophelia knew who it was because there was only one man on this ranch who moved the way he did. Rafferty Holloway worked with the steady economy of a man who had done the same work 10,000 times. He did not waste a single motion. He threw the hay and turned and came back and threw again, and between each throw he looked up at the sky for a half-second, reading it the way another man might read a newspaper. Toby came and stood behind her chair. "He is a good man, ma'am," Toby said quietly. "I know he does not look like it at first, looks like the kind of man you would not want to meet on a dark road. But I have ridden with him for 9 years, and I have slept under his roof every one of them, and I have never once seen him do a wrong thing to a person who did not have it coming. He has a hole in him where his wife used to be. Charlotte, a decade this coming February. He has not been the same since." Ophelia did not turn her head. She kept her eyes on the man in the yard. "He knelt down beside me in the snow," she said softly, "and I thought he was an angel. I think I still do." Toby put his big hand on the back of her chair for a moment. Then he went back to the stove to check his cornbread and started humming his Texas song again. And outside in the yard, Rafferty threw the last of the hay into the lean-to and turned toward the house. And Ophelia watched him come, and she understood for the first time that she was not going to leave this place. Over the next 2 weeks, Ophelia Pembroke began the slow work of learning how to belong somewhere. She started by belonging to the kitchen. Nate brought the flour and the lard up from the root cellar and set them on the counter without being asked, and Ophelia, once her feet could bear her weight for more than a few minutes at a stretch, began to turn the rough male food of the ranch into something that could be called cooking. She made biscuits with crisp golden tops. She made a stew of dried venison and onion and wild sage that Toby declared with tears in his eyes that he tried to pretend were from the pepper to be the first real meal he had eaten since his mother died when he was 9. She made a pie out of dried apples and brown sugar and a crust so thin and flaky that Rafferty Holloway, who had not eaten a pie in a decade because the last pie he ate had been baked by Charlotte, took his first bite of it standing at the kitchen counter and had to turn his face away from the room for a long moment before he could speak again. She did not only cook, she mended the torn elbows of every shirt in the house with stitches so small you could not see them without holding the fabric to the light. She washed and hung out every blanket on the place, and the next time Nate went to sleep under his quilts, he smelled the ghost of pine soap and sunlight. And for the first time in years of ranch bachelorhood, he thought to himself, This is what a home smells like. But the thing she brought into the house that mattered most was the thing no one had realized was missing. She brought in the presence of a decent woman. Within a week, the three men of Stone Creek Ranch had begun to behave differently. Rafferty wiped his boots on the mat before he came in every single time. Toby stopped swearing almost entirely, and when he did slip up and use a word he should not have, he blushed to the roots of his blonde hair and apologized so sincerely that Ophelia had to hide her smile in her apron. Nate started shaving in the morning, which was something the others teased him about gently, until they noticed that Toby had started shaving every other morning too, and then Rafferty started polishing his boots on Sunday evenings. One night a week and a half into her stay, Toby caught all three of them at it. Rafferty oiling his boots at the hearth, Nate combing his hair in the shaving mirror by the wash basin, himself fixing a torn cuff on his best shirt by the lamplight. He started to laugh out loud and could not stop. "Look at us," he said when he could finally speak. "Three wild dogs learning how to sit in a parlor." Rafferty looked up from his boots, and the corner of his mouth twitched upward 1/8 of an inch. "That is because it is not the same ranch." Ophelia, who was sitting by the stove with her Bible open on her lap, heard the exchange and did not look up, but her cheeks went a little pink. A few nights later, the thing happened that cracked the last wall in Rafferty Holloway's chest. Ophelia had finished the supper dishes, and she had taken her usual place in the wooden rocking chair by the fire, and she had opened the Pembroke family Bible on her lap the way she did every evening at this time. She had not read aloud yet in this house. She had read only to herself, moving her lips over the words the way she had done her whole life. But that evening, Nate finally gathered his courage and asked, "Miss Ophelia, I was wondering, could you read that out loud tonight? My mother used to read the Bible to me on Sunday evenings when I was a little boy before she died, and I have forgotten what the words sound like in a woman's voice." Ophelia looked up in surprise. "Of course, if it would please you." Toby set down the bridle he had been polishing and pulled up a stool near the fire. Rafferty, who had been cleaning the Winchester, at the table went very still, but did not move from his chair. Ophelia turned the pages carefully. She knew what she wanted to read. She had known from the moment Nate asked. She began the 23rd Psalm. Her voice was soft at first, and then found its footing, the way a singer's voice does, and the words came into the room one at a time, and they sat down among the three men, like old friends who had been waiting outside in the cold for a long time. "The Lord is my shepherd. I shall not want." Toby closed his eyes and leaned his head back against the wall and let the words wash over him. And for a moment he was 9 years old again, in a one-room cabin in East Texas, and his mother's voice was coming down to him out of the dark over his bed, and he did not have to be a grown man with a gun and a ranch and a responsibility yet. "He maketh me to lie down in green pastures. He leadeth me beside the still waters." At the table, Rafferty Holloway set down the oilcloth. He did not pick it up again. "He restoreth my soul." Something in his chest that had been a block of granite for a decade cracked down the middle along an old fault line, and he felt it go and he could not stop it. "Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for thou art with me." The chair scraped back so fast that Ophelia almost stopped reading. Rafferty stood up. He walked past the fire without a word and issued through the front door onto the porch and into the cold black night. And the door swung shut behind him, and the three people left inside the cabin sat in a silence that was not awkward, but only very full. Ophelia looked from the closed door to Nate. Nate spoke very quietly. That was the verse his best friend whispered to him while dying on the field at Antietam, ma'am. Raph was a drummer boy for the 4th Michigan Infantry, only 13 years old. He has not been able to hear that psalm since. Ophelia closed the book gently. "Will you two forgive me if I step outside for a moment?" She wrapped a wool blanket over her shoulders and picked up a tin cup that she filled with coffee from the pot, and she went out onto the porch. Rafferty Holloway was standing with his hands on the porch rail and his back to the door, looking up at a sky so thick with stars it did not look real. His breath came out in slow clouds. He did not turn around when the door opened. "I thought I could listen to it," he said without looking at her. I know. I thought a decade was long enough that I could sit in a room while a woman read that psalm and not have to walk out. A decade is not very long, Mr. Holloway. Not for a thing like that. He turned then. His eyes caught the starlight in a way that made him look younger than he had looked yesterday, and Ophelia held out the tin cup of coffee. He took it. Thank you. May I sit with you a little while? Yes. They sat on the bench along the porch rail, and they did not speak for a long time. And the mules down in the lean-to shifted in their stalls, and one of them coughed the deep, easy cough of an animal at rest. Somewhere far up the slope, a great horned owl called twice and was answered by another one even further away. After a while, Rafferty began to talk. He talked about the cornfield at Antietam. He told her about a boy from his own regiment, 15 years old, who had taken a ball to the belly in the first hour of the fighting, and how that boy had lain in the shade of a split rail fence for the whole rest of the day, with young Rafferty holding his hand, and how at the very end that boy had whispered the 23rd Psalm all the way through to the line about the valley of the shadow of death, and had not been able to finish it because the shadow had reached him before the words did. He told her about coming home from the war to a Michigan farmhouse and finding that his parents had both died of typhoid while he was away. He told her about the long road west to Montana and about the 3 years he had spent building Stone Creek Ranch with his own hands, one log at a time. He told her about Charlotte Weatherly, the daughter of a Helena storekeeper, and about meeting her at a church picnic and about marrying her 4 months later, and about the 2 good years, and about the February night when Charlotte had died in childbirth in the bedroom at the end of the hall, with the midwife crying in the kitchen and the baby silent in his arms. I told the God of my childhood that I was done, Rafferty said, his voice very even. I said it the way a man tells a debt collector he does not have the money. I said I am done, and I do not have anything left to give you. And then I came back and thawed, and I buried my wife and my son in the same box up on the hill behind the house. And I did not speak a word of prayer over that grave because I did not have any prayers left in me. He paused, and then he told her the part he had never told anyone outside the family. How 6 months after Charlotte died, he had found Toby at a train station in Billings, a 21-year-old orphan from East Texas who was fighting 3 grown men over a loaf of bread, and how Rafferty had walked into the middle of that fight and pulled the boy out by the collar and put him on a horse and brought him home, and how 2 years after that, a 14-year-old boy had shown up at the front gate of Stone Creek Ranch in a cold rain, soaking wet, holding a letter of introduction written in pencil saying his name was Nathaniel Boone, and his father had been killed by bank robbers in Kansas, and he had walked from Dodge City to Montana looking for work, and would Mr. Holloway please give him a chance? I could not refuse that boy, Rafferty said. I did not have it in me, and when I put a roof over his head and food in his belly and a rifle in his hands and showed him how to work a piece of land, I told myself I was just being practical. I told myself I needed the help. But the truth is, Ophelia, I was building myself a family out of the wreckage, and I did not know it until you walked in here and showed me what I had been building all along. Ophelia was quiet for a while after he finished. Then she reached across the bench and put her hand over his very lightly, just for a moment. Mr. Holloway, she said, you say you lost your faith, but you took in 2 boys who had nowhere to go. You built them into men. You fed them and clothed them and taught them how to shoot and how to cut a straight furrow and how to treat a stranger who comes to your door in the snow. That is the work of God, whether you called him by his name while you did it or not. Faith is not always a thing you say out loud. Sometimes faith is what your hands do when your mouth has stopped speaking. He looked at her then, and for a moment, he did not look like a man who had just walked out of a room at the sound of a psalm. He looked like a man who had just been given permission to come back inside. Miss Pembroke, he said, I would be obliged if you would call me Rafferty. Only if you will call me Ophelia. All right, Ophelia. He said her name as if he were tasting it, as if it were a word he had never said before in his life, and in a way it was. After another long silence, he said quietly, I would like you to read the rest of that psalm some night when you are willing. I would like to hear the end of it. I have not heard the end of it since that boy at Antietam could not finish it. I will read it for you, Rafferty, whenever you are ready. They sat there a little longer under the Montana stars, and when the cold finally drove them inside, he held the door open for her with the quiet courtesy of a man who remembered how to be a husband and was only now realizing that he had not forgotten after all. 2 days later, Rafferty told Toby to teach her how to shoot. He did not do it himself, and Ophelia noticed that, and she understood without needing to be told. Rafferty was not the kind of man who could stand close behind a woman and put his hands on her hands to adjust her grip on a Colt revolver without it becoming a thing his heart could not carry. Toby was the fastest shot of the three of them anyway, and Toby had the easy, light way about him that could turn a frightening lesson into something a woman could laugh about. And Toby, above all, was a man who knew exactly how far to stand from a woman who had been hurt. He set up tin cans on top of a row of stumps out past the lean to 15 paces back, and he put an unloaded Colt Peacemaker into her hands first and walked her through the grip and the stance and the breathing. You want to breathe out, Miss Ophelia, not hold your breath. Holding your breath makes the barrel jump. Breathe out slow, and somewhere in the middle of that breath, you touch the trigger. You do not pull it. You touch it the way you would touch a hot stove, and then the gun does the rest. Where did you learn to shoot, Mr. Toby? He smiled a crooked smile. Same way a lot of Texas boys learn, ma'am. On my own. I was 12 years old, and I had a six-shooter my uncle left me and a barn wall full of knotholes to shoot at. I missed about 1,000 shots before I hit my first one. Cost me all the pocket money I had in powder and lead. But when I finally did hit a knothole clean through, I stood there with the gun still smoking, and I knew I was going to be all right in this world. That was the day I figured out I could take care of myself. He paused. And I am telling you that, ma'am, because I want you to know that the feeling you get the first time you hit what you are aiming at is a feeling you should get to have. He loaded the Colt and handed it back to her. Her first shot went wide and kicked up a spray of snow 10 feet past the target. Her second went high. Her third and fourth were closer. She bit her lip. Toby simply watched her with his arms folded and let her find it. Her 11th shot hit the middle can dead center, and the can leapt off the stump and spun in the air and landed in the snow 6 feet away. Ophelia stared at it. Then she turned to Toby with her gray eyes bright and her mouth open in a small, amazed circle. And Toby Kincaid, 30-year-old cowboy who had ridden shotgun for Wells Fargo and pulled a gun on 7 different men in the course of his life and had never in any of those occasions felt the way he felt. Right then grinned at her, the way an older brother grins at a little sister, and said, Miss Ophelia, you are the best student I ever had. Who were your other students, Mr. Toby? You are my only one, ma'am, but you are still the best. She laughed, and the sound of her laughter on the cold air behind the ranch house was a sound that Stone Creek Ranch had not heard in a very long time. And somewhere around the side of the barn, Rafferty Holloway, who had been pretending very hard to be busy with a halter, stopped pretending and listened to the sound and closed his eyes for a moment. On the morning of the 15th day since the blizzard, Nate went to the well to draw water and found a large black bird sitting on the top rail of the split-rail fence staring at him with a flat yellow eye. It was a crow. That by itself was not unusual. What was unusual was that this crow did not fly when Nate approached. It simply sat there watching him, and on one of its scaled black legs was tied a small strip of red cloth. Nate's blood went cold. He had grown up in Kansas. He knew what a tame crow with a red strip on its leg meant out here in the high country, in country where there were no telegraph lines and no reliable postman. Outlaw outfits passed messages by bird. A red strip meant urgent. A red strip meant a man somewhere down in the valley had paid a boy to send word up the mountain, and the word was for whoever was listening. Nate approached the bird slowly with his gloved hand held out. The crow did not move. It had been trained to wait. He closed his fingers gently around its body, and the bird submitted without protest, and Nate carried it back toward the house, and when he got to the porch, he found that his hands were shaking. He went inside and set the crow on the table in front of Rafferty. Rafferty looked at it, Then he looked at the red strip. Then he looked at Nate. Get Toby. Toby came in from the barn. The three men gathered around the table, and Rafferty untied the red strip and found folded inside it a small square of paper about the size of a playing card. He unfolded the paper. There were 3 lines of writing on it in a blocky hand. The mouse is alive. Stone Creek Ranch. Awaiting instructions. Rafferty read the 3 lines twice without expression, and then he refolded the paper and set it on the table between them. Toby spoke first. How long have they known? At least a week. Probably more. This bird did not fly up here by itself. Someone walked part way up the slope to release it, and they released it close enough that it found its way to us. They are watching the house, Toby. They have been watching for a while, and they are only waiting for one thing. The Chinook. The Chinook. Nate pressed his hands flat on the table. Do we tell her? Rafferty looked at the closed door of Ophelia's room. He could hear her in there humming softly as she folded a shirt she had just mended. She had been humming more in the last few days. She had started to move through the house as if she belonged to it. Not yet. Another week. She has earned it. He stood from the table and walked to the window. Start cleaning every rifle in this house, every pistol, every round of ammunition we have. I want the wolf traps reset along the north approach, 6 of them at least under fresh pine boughs so no one sees them. I want the shutters reinforced with oak planking, and I want firing slots cut. I want every head of good stock moved down into the box canyon by the week after next. And I want that tunnel from the root cellar to the big ponderosa out back dug deeper and wider so a grown woman can crawl through it in a hurry if she has to. How long do you think we have? If the wind holds cold, 3 weeks, maybe 4. And if it does not, then God help us, and we had better be ready by the end of this one. A week later, Rafferty sent Toby down the mountain. The cover story was a supply run to the trading post at the foot of the valley, and it was true enough that Toby bought flour and salt and a new set of horseshoes while he was there. But the real purpose of the trip was Silver City, and the real purpose of Silver City was information. Toby was gone 3 days. He rode back up the trail on the 3rd afternoon with his saddlebags heavy and his face the color of old ash. He waited until Ophelia had stepped out to the chicken coop before he spoke. It is worse than we thought, Raph. He sat down at the table and told them what he had learned. He had spent one evening in the back corner of a nameless whiskey house on the outskirts of Silver City, nursing a single drink and listening. Merriweather, it seemed, had convened a public meeting at the Black Dog Saloon the previous week, standing on a card table and announcing to a room full of miners and gamblers that a young woman from Philadelphia had stolen $2,000 in coin from his personal safe and had fled into the mountains with the help of the Holloway outfit up at Stone Creek Ranch. He had posted a reward, $1,000, dead or alive. And worse, he had purchased the cooperation of the county sheriff, a weak-jawed man named Budge Harlan, who owed Merriweather 3 years of gambling debts, and Harlan had issued a warrant in Ophelia's name for grand larceny. The warrant was technically legal. Any bounty hunter in the Montana Territory could ride up to Stone Creek Ranch with that piece of paper in his pocket and demand they hand her over. How many men has he got? Rafferty asked. I counted 12 names on the payroll board behind the bar at the Black Dog. 12 regulars. Driscoll is the worst of them, but not the only one I would worry about. There is a man called Jasper Volk who fought for Quantrill's Raiders in the war. Another named Sewell Pratt, who killed a deputy U.S. Marshal in Wyoming and was never charged. These are not drunks with pistols, Raff. These are professionals. Rafferty absorbed this in silence. Then he said, Nate, when we tell her I want you to be the one who explains the legal situation, you read more law than any of us. Explain to her what the warrant means and what it does not mean, and what her rights are in front of a real judge. Can you do that? I can. Good, because we are telling her tomorrow. The Chinook came on the morning of the 20th day. Rafferty felt it on his face before he opened his eyes. He lay in his bunk and he felt the warm breath of it come in through the tiny gap under the window sash and he knew without having to look outside that the winter that had been their fortress had just become a door that was swinging open. He pulled on his boots and went out on the porch. The wind was soft and dry, and it smelled of pine sap and distant grass. The Salish people of the valleys below called it the snow eater, and in a single day, a Chinook could take 2 feet of pack off a slope. By the time the sun set tonight, the trail up the mountain would be passable for a man on horseback. He went back inside. Today, right now, I'm going to tell her. He knocked on the door of her room softly, and when Ophelia opened it, she saw his face, and she knew before he spoke that something had changed. "Will you come sit at the table with me, Ophelia?" So he told her. He told her everything. The star-shaped boot prints, the crow, the message, the reward, the warrant, and the Chinook. Ophelia listened without interrupting. Her face went very still. When Rafferty finished speaking, she sat for a long time looking down at the steam rising off her coffee cup. Finally, she looked up. "I will leave tonight." "No," Rafferty said. "Rafferty, listen to me. You have given me my life. You do not owe me my death. If I leave tonight on foot, anyone who comes up this trail will find an empty cabin and 3 men who are not worth the trouble. No one has to die for me." Rafferty leaned forward across the table and he spoke to her very quietly, and his eyes did not leave hers for a single second. "Ophelia Pembroke, hear me now. When I knelt in the snow beside that boulder and carried you up that slope in my coat, I swore an oath. I swore it to myself, and I swore it to the God I had not spoken to in a decade, and I swore it on your life because you did not yet have the breath to swear anything on your own behalf. The oath was that I would not let any harm come to you again while I drew breath. That is the oath of a man of Stone Creek Ranch. It does not break. It does not get renegotiated. It does not bend for convenience. Ezekiel Merriweather and 12 hired men can come up this mountain if they want to come. I cannot stop them from riding. But I can promise you, and I do promise you, that every one of them who wants to touch you is going to have to walk across the bodies of 3 Stone Creek men first. And I promise you that that is not going to be an easy walk." Toby stood up from his chair. He did not say anything. He simply walked around the table and came and stood beside Rafferty, and then he folded his arms across his chest, and he looked at Ophelia with the calm, unshakable expression of a man who had already decided. Nate stood up next. He came around and stood on Rafferty's other side. He was the youngest and the gentlest, but his eyes did not waver. 3 men, 1 oath. Ophelia Pembroke looked at them standing there, and the tears came up at last. They came up fast and hot, and she pressed her hands to her mouth, and she cried in the way a person cries when they have spent their whole life waiting to belong to someone and have finally found out they do. "I do not know how to thank you," she whispered through her hands. "You do not thank us, Ophelia," Rafferty said. "Family does not thank family." That night, for the first time since the day she arrived, Ophelia did not sleep. She lay in her small bedroom and she listened to the wind change on the roof above her. The Chinook had been blowing all day, and now in the deep hours she could hear the slow melt, beginning the dripping of water off the eaves, the soft occasional thump of snow sliding off the barn roof. Every one of those sounds was the sound of time running out. She slid out of her bed and pulled a wool shawl around her shoulders and opened her door and went out into the main room. Rafferty was there. He was where she had thought he would be. Sitting in the wooden chair by the stove, the fire down to a low red glow, his hands empty in his lap for once. Not cleaning a rifle, not reading a ledger, just sitting, waiting, she realized, for her. He looked up when she came in. She crossed the floor without speaking and sat down on the braided rug at his feet, and she leaned her cheek against the side of his knee the way a child leans against a trusted parent, and she closed her eyes, and for a long while neither of them said anything at all. Finally, Ophelia spoke without lifting her head. "Rafferty, I have never in my life had anyone of my own. Not my father, not my mother, not a brother or a sister, not a friend I could run to when I was afraid. Not a single soul in the world belonged to me, and I did not belong to a single soul. For 21 years, I have been a piece of a person walking around in a coat pretending to be a whole one. I came west because I thought God was going to give me a husband. I did not know he was going to give me a whole family, and I did not know he was going to give me you. Rafferty's hand came down very slowly and rested on the crown of her head, and his fingers moved once through her hair, and then they stilled there. Ophelia, I am a man of 39 years. I have seen things no person should have to see. I carry a lot of dead inside me, and I did not think there was any room left in me for a living thing. I did not think I was ever going to sit in this room with a woman again and feel my own heart come back to life the way it used to be before Charlotte died. I did not know I still had a heart that could do that. She lifted her head then and looked up at him in the red firelight. His eyes were wet. She had not thought his eyes could be wet. He bent down and he kissed her once very softly on the mouth. It was the first kiss of her life. It was the first kiss of his in a decade. It was a thing that happened in the space of 2 heartbeats, and it did not ask for anything, and it did not take anything. And when he drew back from her, she understood the way you understand a verse you have read 100 times and finally heard that this was a man who would carry her name inside him for the rest of his days, whether he ever kissed her again or not. I am sorry, he whispered. I should not have. Do not be sorry, Rafferty. Please do not be sorry. He closed his eyes, then he opened them and looked at her again. Go back to bed, Ophelia. You need to sleep. Tomorrow is going to be a long day, and the day after that is going to be longer. She stood up. At the door of her small bedroom, she turned and looked back at him one more time. He was still sitting in the chair by the fire watching her go. She smiled at him, a small, exhausted half-smile, and he nodded to her once and she closed the door. The next morning was the morning of the Last Supper. Rafferty knew it, and Toby knew it, and Nate knew it, and Ophelia knew it too, even though none of them said so. The Chinook had worked all day and all night, and by mid-morning the trail up from Miller's Crossing was a line of mud and broken crust. Any rider with a good horse could make it up now. They spent the day finishing the fortifications. Wolf traps along the north approach under fresh pine boughs. Shutters reinforced with oak planking. Firing slots cut at the 4 cardinal windows. The big mare and the 2 best working geldings walked down into the box canyon with a rope gate across the entrance. Ammunition brought up from the root cellar and stacked on the pine table in neat little pyramids of brass and lead. Ophelia worked too. She loaded every revolver in the house with the careful attention Toby had taught her. She filled water pitchers and set them by each window. She tore an old sheet into bandages and rolled them and set them with a bottle of whiskey and a threaded needle on a clean cloth by the hearth. She boiled a great pot of water and kept the fire under it low. And she slipped a small derringer that Toby had given her that afternoon into the pocket of her apron. At dusk, Rafferty came in from the yard and washed his hands at the basin and said, "Supper." They sat down at the long pine table. Ophelia had made biscuits and a stew and a pot of coffee so strong it could raise the dead. A single oil lamp burned in the middle of the table. Outside, the wind was still warm, and in the distance, faint as a rumor, they could hear the slow drip of the melt. Toby raised a small glass of whiskey, a thing he rarely did. "Gentlemen, and Miss Ophelia, I have been thinking about this all afternoon, and I want to say it before the sun goes down, because tomorrow is not a day I want to go into without having said it. Before Miss Ophelia came up that trail, we were 3 wild dogs living under one roof. We called each other brothers, but we did not know what a family was. We knew loyalty. We knew work. But we did not know what it was to sit down at a table and feel like the table had a middle. Miss Ophelia, you gave us a middle. You gave us something to sit around. If tomorrow is the last day any of us has, I want it written down somewhere that I do not regret a single minute of the last 3 weeks." Nate raised his cup of water. "Miss Ophelia, you are the sister I never had. I want you to know that. Whatever comes tomorrow, I want you to know I went knowing what a sister was finally after 24 years. And I am grateful." And then Rafferty. He lifted his glass last, and he simply looked across the table at Ophelia Pembroke, and his eyes were shining in the lamplight, in a way that none of them had ever seen. A decade ago, I stood in the yard of this ranch and I told the God of my fathers that I did not have anything left to give him. I was wrong. I know I was wrong because I am sitting here tonight at a table where a woman is reading a psalm every evening and a boy who was dying in a snowdrift 20 days ago is pouring me a cup of coffee. And if that is not the work of the God I said I was done with, then I do not know what it is, and I am not going to pretend anymore. Ophelia, you did not come up this mountain by accident. You did not find this door by accident. You were sent. And I want to say that out loud in this room in front of these two boys because I want the walls of this house to hear me say it while there is still time. You were sent, and whatever comes through that door tomorrow is going to have to come through me first. He drank the whiskey. Ophelia sat with her hands folded on the table. Her eyes were full. When she finally spoke, she spoke quietly and she said only 4 words. Read the psalm, Nate. Nate fetched the Pembroke family Bible and set it in her hands. Ophelia opened to the 23rd Psalm one more time. The 3 men bowed their heads. The oil lamp flickered between them. Outside, the warm wind moved through the pines, and the night beyond the wind was very dark and very close. She began to read. She read all the way through this time, every word. And when she came to the line that Rafferty had not been able to sit through 20 days ago, she read it clearly and without hurrying, and he kept his head bowed, and he did not walk out of the room. Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for thou art with me. Thy rod and thy staff, they comfort me. Somewhere outside in the pines, a single horse nickered. None of the 4 people at the table heard it yet, but tomorrow would hear it. Tomorrow would hear everything. The morning that came after the Last Supper at Stone Creek Ranch came in red. It came in red the way a wound comes in. The eastern sky above the pass rose up in a slow bloom of scarlet and orange that bled across the melting snowfield and turned the whole of the yard the color of a fresh cut. Rafferty Holloway stood on the porch with a cup of coffee in one hand and his Winchester leaning against the rail beside him, and he looked at that sky for a long time before he spoke. Red dawn, he said quietly. Toby Kincaid came up beside him with a rifle of his own across his shoulder. Sailor's warning. This is not a sailor's sky, Toby. This is a man's sky, and the warning is for us. Somewhere inside the house, Ophelia was pouring fresh coffee into the tin cups they would carry to their firing positions. Somewhere behind the house, Nate was making a final check of the tunnel from the root cellar to the big Ponderosa, crawling through it on his hands and knees with a lantern in his teeth to be sure the packed earth had not collapsed overnight from the warm wind. Rafferty set his coffee down on the rail. He turned to Toby. You on the roof. Henry Repeater. Take the spyglass in the extra cartridge box. Do not fire until I fire. When I fire, start with the man on the far right of their line because the man on the far right is always the one most likely to circle. I understand, Raff. Nate inside at the west window with the Winchester 73. Ophelia at the east window with the Colt in the Derringer in reserve. I will stand at the front door. And what if they come from the back? Then the wolf traps along the north approach will tell us, and Nate will move to the back window. But they will not come from the back first. Merriweather is too proud a man to creep in the back door of anywhere. He will come straight up the front of this ranch because he wants to stand in my yard and tell me to hand her over. That is the kind of man he is. He needs the yard. He needs the words. Toby looked at him sidelong, and when he has had his words, then I am going to give him an answer he will remember. They stood there in the red dawn a little longer, 2 men who had ridden together for 9 winters. There was nothing left to say. Every word that had been worth saying had already been said last night at the supper table, and a man does not repeat that kind of thing in the morning. He carries it in his chest, and he goes to work. Inside the house, Ophelia came to the front door with 2 cups of coffee and handed one to Toby for the roof and one to Rafferty for the porch. Her hands did not shake. That was the thing Rafferty noticed, and he would remember it for the rest of his life. Her hands did not shake. Rafferty, she said quietly. Yes, Ophelia. Whatever happens today, I want you to know that if I had a chance to walk up that trail again from Miller's Crossing, knowing everything I know now, I would walk it the same way. Every step. He looked at her for a long moment, and the red dawn caught in her gray eyes and turned them the color of copper, and he did not trust himself to say what he wanted to say. He only nodded once, but the nod said everything. She went back inside. The door closed softly behind her. They waited. An hour passed. The red of the sky bled away into the pale blue of a thawing Montana morning. The melt resumed with the sun, and all around the ranch the slow dripping sound of winter ending went on and on like a clock that would not stop. Another hour passed, and then Toby's voice came down from the roof, low and flat. Raff, movement. Rafferty went very still. Where south, along the tree line above the box canyon, I count 11 riders. 11. Merriweather is in the second rank with a black overcoat. Driscoll is riding point. Rafferty closed his eyes for a half second. 11 was more than he had hoped for. He had been telling himself 8 or 9. 11 was a number that meant someone was going to die on this porch today, and he was going to have to be very precise about who. How are they moving? Slow, in a loose column, no flankers yet. Stay down until they clear the tree line. When they hit the open ground between the fence and the house, call it. Do not fire. He stepped back inside the house. Nate was at the west window with the Winchester across his knees. Ophelia was at the east window with the Colt laid on the sill and the Derringer in her apron pocket, and her face was the face of a woman who had already walked through a valley of shadow once in her life and had decided she would not flinch at the second. They are here, Rafferty said. Nate swallowed once. How many? 11. Nate nodded. His jaw was set, 24 years old, and he said nothing else, and Rafferty felt a flash of pride so sharp it almost hurt him. Rafferty went to the front door and took up his position just inside it with the Winchester in both hands and the muzzle pointed at the floor, and he waited for the sound of hoof beats on the thawing earth of his own yard. The riders came clear of the tree line at a walking pace. They stopped about 60 yards from the porch at the edge of rifle range, but well short of the point where a bullet could be guaranteed to do its work. For a long moment, the two sides looked at each other across the thawing snow. Then Merriweather stood up in his stirrups. He was a short man, heavy in the belly, dressed in a black overcoat that was too fine for a Montana ranch yard, and a flat-brimmed hat that had been cleaned for the occasion. His face at this distance was a pale smudge, but his voice carried across the open ground with the practiced projection of a saloon keeper who had spent 20 years shouting over poker tables. Rafferty Holloway, I know you are in there. I know you have my Philadelphia mouse inside that house. This is not your quarrel, Mr. Holloway. She stole $2,000 from my private safe and ran for the high country. I forgive you for taking her in. I am a forgiving man. Send her out and I will pay you $500 in good Wells Fargo script for your trouble. You have 10 minutes to think it over. He sat back down in his saddle. He folded his hands on the pommel. He waited. Rafferty Holloway stood inside his own front door for 30 seconds without moving. He was not thinking about the offer. He was thinking about angles. He was thinking about the position of the man third from the left who was riding a nervous paint horse that kept trying to drift sideways. He was thinking about where the wolf trap lay buried on the north approach just off the flank of Merriweather's formation. He was thinking about which man would be the first to make a mistake. Then he opened the door. He stood just inside the threshold with the Winchester raised and the stock set against his shoulder, and he pitched his voice across the yard in the flat, dry tone of a man who was tired of the sound of other men's words. Merriweather. Yes, Mr. Holloway. There is a line in the book of Proverbs. It says, he that diggeth a pit shall fall into it. You dug this pit. You pointed a young woman up a trail in a blizzard because she was poor. You sent Cormac Driscoll to stand behind a rock and watch her die. You put a bounty on her head when the mountain did not finish your killing for you. You dug the pit, Mr. Merriweather, and now, sir, I am going to invite you to step into it. He fired. The Winchester barked once and the hat flew off Ezekiel Merriweather's head and spun into the snow, beside his horse and rolled and stopped, and Meriwether went sideways out of his saddle with a strangled shout. That was not fear and was not pain, but was the particular sound a bully makes when he discovers that someone has decided not to be afraid of him anymore. That was the first shot. The second shot came 3 seconds later from the roof. Toby Kincaid had been watching the two riders on the far right of the line from the beginning, because Rafferty had told him to, and when the Winchester barked below, Toby put his eye to the Henry repeater's front sight and squeezed. 200 yards of cold thawing air. The iron sights of a Henry were not meant for that kind of work, but Toby had been shooting at knotholes in a Texas barn wall since he was 12 years old, and his hand remembered things his mind had long since stopped thinking about. The shot took the rider on the far right through the shoulder blade and knocked him sideways out of the saddle, and the man hit the snow and did not get up. The other rider on the far right wheeled his horse to bolt for the tree line and rode directly into the wolf trap Rafferty had set under the pine boughs 3 days ago. The trap closed on the horse's foreleg with a sound like the snap of a green branch, and the horse screamed and went down in a thrashing tangle of legs and leather, and its rider went over the pommel into a drift, and by the time he clawed his way free, Toby's second shot had found him between the shoulder and the neck, and he sat down very slowly in the snow. 2 down, Toby called from the roof. 9 left. Down on the open ground, Meriwether was screaming orders and crawling on his belly behind a fallen cedar log for cover. "Take the house, shoot the roof off that son of a bitch!" The remaining riders broke from their column and fanned out. 5 of them spurred their horses forward in a ragged charge across the thawing yard, firing revolvers from the saddle. The other 2 dismounted and went flat in the snow behind the log with Meriwether. Rafferty had been waiting for the charge. He braced the Winchester against the doorframe, and he fired 3 shots in 5 seconds. And the shooting of Rafferty Holloway that day would be told about in Silver City for 30 years afterward by men who had not even been there to see it. The first shot took the lead charger clean off his horse. The second shot took the man just behind him. The third shot went through the crown of a gray felt hat and the skull beneath it, and the third man pitched forward over his horse's neck and was dragged for 10 yards before his boot came loose of the stirrup. 3 shots. 3 men. 5 down, Rafferty called to the room behind him. 6 left. The 2 remaining mounted riders broke off the charge. One wheeled his horse and bolted for the cover of the lean-to. The other turned his horse sideways to use it as a shield, which was a mistake because it took Toby on the roof less than 2 seconds to put a round from the Henry through the horse's shoulder. The horse went down hard. The rider kicked free and ran hunched low back toward the cedar log. 6 down, Toby called. Inside the house at the east window, Ophelia Pembroke crouched beside the sill with the Colt in her hands and her breath coming hard and steady. She was watching her sector the way Toby had taught her, and she was not firing yet because Toby had told her never to fire until she had a clean target, because the sound of a woman's revolver from inside a house would tell the enemy exactly which window to come for. That was when they heard the footstep behind them. It was the smallest sound. It was the sound a man makes when he has crept along the back wall of a house with the melt dripping around him and has come in through the back door that was supposed to be bolted and was not, because in the chaos of the first shots, the bolt had been overlooked and has now stepped onto the bearskin rug in the back hallway and is trying very hard not to be heard. Nate turned his head 1/4 of an inch. Cormac Driscoll stood in the doorway of the hallway with a long-bladed bowie knife in his right hand and a Remington Army revolver in his left, and his eyes were the color of a river bottom, and his black mustache was wet with melting snow, and there was a slow, tight grin on his face that said he had done this before, and this was the part he enjoyed. He raised the Remington. "Nate!" Ophelia screamed. Nate moved. He moved the way a man moves when 24 years of being the smallest and the quickest has taught him that speed is the only gift he is going to get in a fight. He threw himself sideways off his chair just as the Remington went off, and the round meant for his heart went through the wooden frame of the west window 6 inches above his head. Nate hit the floor rolling and came up inside the reach of Driscoll's pistol arm and he drove his shoulder into the bigger man's ribs, and they went down together in a tangle of limbs. The Remington fell away. The Bowie knife did not. Nate Boone had fought for his life in Kansas alleys when he was 12 years old, and he had fought for his food in train stations when he was 13. And every one of those fights had taught him that if you were smaller than your enemy, you could not afford to be slower. He got his left hand on Driscoll's knife wrist and his right elbow into Driscoll's throat. And he held on, and Driscoll, who was bigger and heavier and meaner, began to twist the knife down toward him inch by inch. The blade came down toward Nate's face. Nate's arm shook. His elbow was not enough. Driscoll was grinning now, that slow, tight grin, because he could feel the younger man's strength beginning to go. The blade touched the skin under Nate's left eye. A thin red line opened. "Hold still, boy," Driscoll whispered. "This is gonna be quick." Then the world went white with a sound like a slammed door. The report of a Colt peacemaker fired inside a wood-walled room is not like the report of a rifle fired outside. It is a physical thing. It slaps the air and the walls and the inside of your skull, and for half a second after it, every other sound in the world stops. Cormac Driscoll's right shoulder jerked backward as if an invisible hand had yanked it, and the Bowie knife fell out of his grip and clattered across the floorboards. And the slow, tight grin drained off his face the way the politeness had drained off it 3 weeks ago at Miller's Crossing. Ophelia Pembroke stood in the middle of the main room with the Colt peacemaker still raised and the smoke still drifting from the mausoleum, and her gray eyes as wide and steady as a winter sky. She had fired her 11th shot of her life. The previous 10 had been at tin cans on stumps. Nate Boone, with blood running down his cheek from the thin red line under his eye, shoved Driscoll off him and scrambled up and grabbed the fallen Remington in one motion, and he put the barrel of it against Driscoll's forehead. His face was the face of a man who wanted very much to pull the trigger and was not going to, because he had been raised by a man who did not pull triggers once the fight was over. "Nate," it was Ophelia's voice behind him, still steady, barely. "Nate, do not. Please." "I am not going to miss Ophelia. I am not." Driscoll made a wet sound. His shoulder was ruined. He was not going to be a problem for the rest of this fight. Nate dragged him by the collar into the corner and threw a loop of leather cord around his wrist behind his back and pulled it tight. Ophelia still had the Colt raised. Her arms were beginning to tremble now. Only now, and Nate came to her quickly and closed his hand gently over her wrist and lowered the gun for her. "Miss Ophelia, look at me." She looked. "You just saved my life. Do you hear me? You just saved my life, and there is nothing in the good book that holds that against a person. Nothing. You did the right thing. I shot a man, Nate. You shot a man who was 2 seconds from cutting my throat. There is a difference between killing and defending, and the Lord knows the difference even when we cannot feel it yet. You are defending your family. Do you hear me? I hear you. Good. Now I need you back at your window, because this is not over yet." She went. Outside, the second stage of the battle had already begun. Toby on the roof and Rafferty in the door had the surviving Merriweather men pinned down behind the cedar log, and the Merriweather men were discovering that they did not have a good plan for what to do when their plans stopped working. 2 more of them tried to break for the tree line and were cut down before they made 30 yards. Another one threw down his rifle and raised his hands, and Rafferty Holloway, who was many things but was not a murderer, called from the door, "Walk out into the middle of the yard, hands on your head, no sudden movement." And the man walked out and dropped to his knees in the melting snow. That left Merriweather and one man beside him behind the cedar log. Merriweather had been hiding behind that log for 4 minutes now, and 4 minutes is a very long time to crouch in slush while your hired gunmen die around you one at a time. The last man was beginning to figure out that the math no longer favored the people who were paying him, and when men like that figure that out, they do the thing they always do. He ran. He came up out of the slush and bolted for the tree line at a dead sprint, and he made it 6 strides before Toby took him cleanly from the roof. "10 down," Toby called, and that left 1. Ezekiel Merriweather was alone behind the cedar log with 10 men down around him, and the thaw water running in slow rivulets past his boots, and after a long moment he made a decision that did not surprise Rafferty at all. He stood up. He did not stand up to surrender. He ran in a low crouch to the horse of one of his dead men, hauled himself into the saddle, and spurred that horse hard down in the back trail toward Miller's Crossing at a flat run. Rafferty Holloway had been waiting for this too. He stepped out of the front door onto the porch. "Toby, hold the yard. Nate, watch Driscoll and keep Ophelia with you. I am going after him." "Raff, do not argue with me, Toby. This part is mine. I promised this part to myself on the first day I came back from the boulder. Hold the house." He whistled once a short, sharp note. Out of the lean to his black gelding, Shadow came at a trot already saddled, because Rafferty had saddled him before dawn. Rafferty swung up into the saddle in a single motion and laid the Winchester across his thighs and kicked Shadow into a gallop. And man and horse shot out of the yard in pursuit of the last living man who had come up the mountain to kill Ophelia Pembroke. The back trail from Stone Creek Ranch down toward Miller's Crossing was 2.5 miles of switchbacks through melting pine forest. Shadow was a better horse than Meriwether's stolen mount, and Rafferty knew every turn of the trail, and by the time they had gone half a mile, Rafferty had closed the gap from 200 yards to 70. Meriwether looked back once over his shoulder and saw how close Rafferty was, and his face went the color of the belly of a fish. He clawed at his waist for the pistol he carried there, and he turned awkwardly in the saddle and fired blind over his shoulder. The shot went wild in the general sense and found its mark in the specific sense. It went past Rafferty's head by 6 inches and clipped the top of his left arm just below the shoulder, and a line of fire opened along the muscle there. And Rafferty grunted once, and the Winchester went sideways in his hands, and he dropped from Shadow's back and rolled into the soft, melting snow beside the trail with his left arm going numb underneath him. Meriwether reined up hard. He looked back. He saw Rafferty lying in the snow, not moving. He saw Shadow trotting riderless down the trail with empty stirrups swinging. A slow, cold smile spread across Ezekiel Meriwether's face. He dismounted. He walked back up the trail with his pistol drawn, squelching through the melt, and he came up beside the crumpled shape in the snow, and he nudged it once with his boot. "Not so much now, are you, mountain man?" That was when Rafferty Holloway opened his eyes and brought the Winchester up from where it had been lying underneath him, and he fired once from flat on his back, and the round took Ezekiel Meriwether in the right knee and blew the joint apart, and Meriwether went down screaming into the slush of the thawing trail. Rafferty stood up slowly. His left arm hung wrong. His shirt sleeve was already dark with blood. He walked over to where Meriwether was writhing in the snow, and he kicked the pistol out of the man's reach, and then he planted the stock of the Winchester against his own hip and aimed the muzzle down at Meriwether's face. Meriwether was crying now. The slow, cold smile was gone. He looked up at Rafferty Holloway with the terrified eyes of a man who had only ever been on the giving end of pain and had never once imagined he would be on the receiving end. "Do it!" Meriwether screamed. "Do it! You self-righteous bastard! You are no different than I am, Holloway. You killed for the Union when you were a boy, and you killed for your ranch when you were a man, and now you are going to kill for your little Philadelphia Bible girl. So stop pretending and do it." Rafferty Holloway looked down at him for a long, quiet moment. He felt the pull of it. He would not pretend later to himself or to anyone else that he had not felt it. A lifetime of stored-up iron, and every ounce of it wanted him to pull the trigger right now and end Ezekiel Meriwether and be done with the whole rotten business. And then Rafferty thought of Ophelia Pembroke reading the 23rd Psalm in the lamplight at his supper table. And then he thought of the hairline crack she had opened in the stone wall of his chest on the night of the blizzard. And then he thought of the oath, and he understood with the slow, clean understanding of a man who has finally reached the end of a long argument with himself that a man who killed Ezekiel Meriwether in cold blood on a thawing trail would not be a man fit to stand beside Ophelia Pembroke at any altar that had ever been built. He took his finger off the trigger. "No, Meriwether, I am not going to kill you." "What? You wanted me to kill you. That is why you goaded me. You know exactly what waits for you in Helena once the federal marshal gets his hands on you. You know about the rope and the crowd and the slow walk up the steps. You would rather die here quick and angry in the snow than die there slow and public with your name in the newspapers. You want the easy death. I am not going to give it to you. You sent that woman up my trail in a blizzard to freeze because she was poor. You sent Cormac Driscoll to stand behind a rock and watch her die. You put a price on her head. You turned the law of this territory into a weapon against a woman who had never in her life done anything except pray to her own God. And now you are going to walk on that ruined knee every step of the way down this mountain behind my horse. And you are going to stand trial in Helena in front of a federal judge, and you are going to hang in front of a crowd of the decent people you have spent your life preying on. That is the price of the pit you dug, Mr. Merriweather. Not a bullet in the snow, a rope in the sun. He lowered the Winchester. He bent down slowly because his left arm was going bad on him, and he pulled a length of rope from the saddlebag of Shadow, who had trotted back up beside him, and he tied Ezekiel Merriweather's hands behind his back with the careful knots of a man who had tied cattle and men in his time. Then he tied the other end of the rope to his own saddle horn. Get up, Mr. Merriweather. We are going home. And he mounted Shadow one-handed, and he turned the black horse around, and he started back up the trail towards Stone Creek Ranch at a slow, deliberate walk with the rope taut behind him. Ezekiel Merriweather crawled. When Rafferty Holloway came back into the yard of Stone Creek Ranch, pulling a bleeding man on a rope behind him, the sun had climbed halfway up the pale Montana sky, and the yard was strewn with the bodies of the men who had come up this mountain to kill a woman who prayed. Toby was down off the roof now, moving among the fallen. Nate was on the porch with the captured survivor under guard. Driscoll was slumped against the far wall of the main room, still tied, still bleeding, still alive. And Ophelia Pembroke came out of the house at a run. She saw Rafferty on Shadow, and she saw the blood on his left sleeve that had run all the way down to his wrist and was dripping off his fingers onto the pommel. And she ran to him without thinking about the mud, or the dead men, or the rope, or the fat man on his hands and knees at the end of it. Rafferty, not Mr. Holloway. Rafferty. The first time she had said his name in the yard where anyone could hear it, and the sound of it in her voice went through him like a bell. He started to swing his right leg over to dismount, and his left arm gave out, and he would have gone down in the mud if Ophelia had not already been there under his good shoulder. She took his weight as if he weighed nothing. She guided him down. She steadied him on his feet. Toby, Nate, inside now. I need the kitchen table cleared, and the whiskey, and the needle, and the lantern lit. Tie this man to the post in the horse corral and leave him there. We will deal with him when we have dealt with my husband. She did not realize until an hour later that she had said the word "my husband" out loud in front of two cowboys and a federal prisoner and a dying man. Neither did any of the men. It was the kind of truth that had simply walked into the room ahead of the ceremony and sat down and waited to be noticed. On the kitchen table of Stone Creek Ranch, in the slanting light of a late morning that smelled of pine and wet earth and the end of a long winter, Ophelia Pembroke stitched the bullet wound in Rafferty Holloway's left arm with the bone needles from her mother's sewing kit and threads she had dipped in whiskey to clean it. Her hands were perfectly steady. They had shaken earlier when she had lowered the Colt after shooting Driscoll, but they did not shake now because Rafferty's life was inside those hands, and there was no room in her for shaking. He watched her face as she worked, the small line of concentration between her brows, the way her lower lip was caught between her teeth, the way her eyes, which had been the color of storm water 3 weeks ago, were now the color of clear morning ski. Ophelia, hush, Rafferty. I am almost done. Two more stitches. Ophelia, what is it? You shot a man in my house today. Her hands faltered for half a second. Then they steadied. She drew the needle through again. Yes. How do you feel about it? She finished the last stitch before she answered. She tied the thread off and cut it and set the needle down, and only then did she look up. I feel that there is a difference between killing and defending, and that the Lord knows the difference. I feel that I love Nate the way a sister loves a brother, and the idea of losing him was more than I could bear. And I feel that God will forgive the kind of shooting I did this morning because he is a better accountant of intent than we are. Rafferty looked at her a long time. Then he reached out with his good right hand, and he took her left hand and held it. Ophelia Pembroke, I have one more question for you today, and I need you to hear it clean, because I am not a man who says this kind of thing twice. I am listening, Rafferty. Will you marry me not as a mail-order bride to a man from an advertisement, not as a charity case to a rancher who took you in out of a blizzard, not for any reason except that I have loved you since the night you told me your mother had prayed for a man like me to come and find you. I have loved you since I heard you read the 23rd Psalm all the way through to the end and watched my own wall come down. I am 39 years old, Ophelia. I have a hole in me where my first wife used to live. I have put that hole in order at last, and what I am offering you is not the heart I had before. It is the heart I have now. It is the heart you built back. Will you take it? Ophelia Pembroke did not answer right away. She brought his rough, calloused hand up to her cheek, and she pressed it there, and she closed her eyes, and two slow tears slid down her face and ran over the back of his hand. And when she finally opened her eyes, she was smiling. Yes, Rafferty Holloway, 1,000 times yes. She bent down and she kissed him once very gently on the mouth. It was their second kiss. The first had been in front of a dying fire in the small hours of the morning, with the Chinook wind whispering outside. The second was at the kitchen table of Stone Creek Ranch in the middle of a Tuesday in November, with her husband to be bleeding through a fresh bandage, and somehow that second kiss felt like a wedding all by itself. From the doorway came the sound of two cowboys trying not to cry and failing. Toby Kincaid wiped his face with the back of his wrist and said in the roughest voice he could manage, "It is about damn time, Raph." Nate Boone, whose left cheek now wore the thin red line Driscoll had given him, and who would wear the scar for the rest of his life, said very softly, "Worth the wait." A week later, when Rafferty's arm had begun to heal enough that he could ride, the four of them went down the mountain to Helena. They took with them Cormac Driscoll and Ezekiel Merriweather, bound in the back of a buckboard wagon that Toby had borrowed from the nearest decent neighbor. The trip took 3 days. On the second day, they came upon an emigrant wagon that had broken an axle in the mud of the thawing track, and Rafferty Holloway, with two bound outlaws in his own wagon and a bullet wound stitched in his left arm, ordered his brothers to stop and help. Toby looked at him in disbelief for about 3 seconds and then obeyed without arguing, because the code of the West did not make exceptions for convenience. They spent 4 hours with the emigrant family. Toby and Nate cut and fitted a new axle from a pine they felled beside the trail. Ophelia sat with the emigrant's wife and her 3 small children and fed them biscuits from her own basket and prayed with them over the cold supper fire. The emigrant's name was Jonas Whitaker, and he had lost a brother in Silver City the previous spring to a man named Ezekiel Merriweather over a card game gone wrong. And when Jonas Whitaker recognized the fat man tied in the back of the Holloway wagon, he stood very still for a long moment, and then he walked over to Rafferty and gripped his good right hand in both of his. "Mr. Holloway, I do not know what led you to do this thing that no one else in this territory was willing to do, but I am going to tell my children and my grandchildren the name of the man who brought Ezekiel Merriweather down from the Bitterroot in the back of a wagon. You have my thanks, sir, for the rest of my days." They came into Helena on the afternoon of the 3rd day. The federal marshal, gray-haired man named Jeremiah Stokes, who had been hunting Ezekiel Merriweather without success for 6 months, stood on the steps of the federal courthouse and watched Rafferty Holloway drive his wagon up the main street of Helena with 2 chained men in the back and 2 mounted cowboys flanking it, and a young woman with dark honey hair in a clean gray dress riding beside the driver's bench, and the marshal took off his hat and said out loud to no one in particular, "Well, I will be a son of a gun." Inside the federal courthouse, the marshal took down the whole of Ophelia Pembroke's testimony in the presence of a circuit judge named Wilbur Hayes. It took 4 hours. She did not weep. She told every part of it, from the advertisement in the Matrimonial Herald, to the widow on the train, to the $17, to Cormac Driscoll at Miller's Crossing, to the 3 miles in the blizzard, to the boulder, to the moment when Rafferty Holloway had knelt beside her in the snow and spoken a prayer he had not spoken in a decade. She laid her grandmother's Bible on the judge's desk as evidence. Judge Wilbur Hayes listened without interruption. When Ophelia was done, the judge cleaned his spectacles on a handkerchief and said, "Miss Pembroke, in 41 years on the bench, I have heard a great many stories. I have not heard many like yours." The trial was held 3 weeks later. Ezekiel Merriweather was convicted of federal mail fraud, attempted murder in the first-degree conspiracy to commit murder, corruption of a county officer, and 5 lesser counts. The sentence was the rope. Cormac Driscoll was sentenced to 20 years of hard labor at the federal prison in Deer Lodge. He would not survive the first 5. Ezekiel Merriweather was hanged on a bright autumn morning in the public square of Helena in front of a crowd of 200 townspeople, many of whom had lost money or friends or daughters to him over the years. Ophelia Pembroke did not attend. She remained at the boarding house where the 4 of them were staying, and she read from the Psalms, and she prayed for the soul of the man who had tried to kill her, because she had been raised to believe that a Christian woman prayed even for her enemies, especially when they were at the end of their road. Rafferty Holloway did not attend either. He stayed with her. On a bright afternoon in May of 1889, with the last of the snow gone from the lower slopes of the Bitterroot, and the first wildflowers beginning to show in the meadow behind Stone Creek Ranch, Rafferty Holloway and Ophelia Pembroke were married on the front porch of the main house by a circuit preacher named Elijah Calder, who had ridden up from Helena for the occasion. The wedding was small, and it was perfect. Ophelia wore a white dress that had been sent to her as a gift from a woman named Abigail Thornton, the widow in the black mourning dress on the Dakota train, who had read about the Stone Creek story in the Helena newspaper and had tracked Ophelia down by letter. The dress had been her own wedding dress 30 years before, and she had sent it with a note that said, "I prayed for you every night, child, just as I promised. Wear this in remembrance of the prayers that were answered." Rafferty wore a clean white shirt and his best black coat. In his breast pocket, folded very small, was a page from the Pembroke family Bible containing the 23rd Psalm, which Ophelia had placed there herself that morning. Toby Kincaid stood as best man in a shirt that Ophelia had ironed for him the night before, and he did not say a word through the whole ceremony, because if he had opened his mouth, he would have wept, and Toby Kincaid did not intend to weep at his brother's wedding. Nate Boone read from 1 Corinthians. "Love suffereth long and is kind. Love beareth all things, believeth all things, hopeth all things, endureth all things." He read it in a clear, steady voice and did not stumble once. When Reverend Calder asked, "Do you, Rafferty Holloway, take this woman to be your lawfully wedded wife in sickness and in health, for richer, for poorer, until death do you part?" Rafferty did not hesitate. "I do, until the day I die, and after." Ophelia Pembroke became Ophelia Holloway on the porch of Stone Creek Ranch under a May sky so blue it looked like the color of hope itself. That evening, after the last of the small gathering had drifted down the slope toward their own wagons, and after Toby and Nate had walked out to the new cabin they had built together that spring, a half-mile from the main house to give the newlyweds their privacy, Rafferty Holloway took Ophelia's hand and walked her into the small room at the back of the main house that had become their new bedroom. He paused at the threshold. "Ophelia, I have waited a long time to know a woman again. I can wait another night if that is what you want. I can wait another 10 nights. You are the choice, not me." Her answer was to lift up on her toes and kiss him, and then to take his good right hand in both of hers and draw him gently through the doorway. The door closed softly behind them. When morning came, a new life had begun in the house at the end of the valley. 6 years passed over Stone Creek Ranch, the way 6 years pass over any piece of ground that is loved and worked and prayed over. The cattle were bred and sold and bred again. The barn was expanded twice. A small schoolhouse was built down the slope near the main road, and Toby Kincaid married a bright Irish girl named Molly Callahan, whose laughter carried across the yard on warm summer evenings, the way a wind chime carries. Nate Boone went to Helena for 2 years to read the law under Judge Wilbur Hayes, and he came back with a license to practice and opened the only honest legal office in Silver City, and he married the school teacher there, a patient woman named Prudence Wentworth. And Rafferty and Ophelia Holloway had 2 children. The first was a boy born in the summer of 1891, and they named him Samuel after Ophelia's father. The second was a girl born in the spring of 1893, and they named her Grace because that was what they had been given. On a warm afternoon in early May of 1895, Rafferty Holloway sat on the porch of Stone Creek Ranch with Samuel on one knee and Grace on the other, and the Pembroke family Bible open across both of them, reading aloud from the 23rd Psalm, in a voice that Samuel, who was almost 4 years old, had begun to recognize as the voice his father used for the most important words. Ophelia came out of the house behind them with a basket of clean laundry against her hip and paused in the doorway to watch her husband and her children in the slanting gold light of the late afternoon. Her hair was still the color of dark honey. There were the smallest lines now at the corners of her eyes. She was 28 years old, and she was beautiful in a way she had not been at 21, which is to say she was beautiful like a woman who had been loved every day for 6 years and had counted every one of them. Rafferty looked up and saw her standing there. He smiled. It was a smile he had not had in him 7 years ago. He had a whole collection of smiles now, and Ophelia had built every one of them. Out in the yard, Toby Kincaid came riding up from the south pasture, leading a young colt he had been gentling for a week. Behind him, walking from the cabin, Toby shared with Molly, came Molly herself with their baby boy Connor in her arms. From the other direction up the wagon road came Nate and Prudence in the small buggy Nate had bought in Helena, waving as they came into view. They were coming for supper. They came for supper every Sunday now. It was the tradition of Stone Creek Ranch, and it was the tradition of the Holloway family. And it was in a way that Ophelia alone could see the answer to the prayer she had prayed on the narrow bed in her aunt's attic on Chestnut Street in Philadelphia when she was 15 years old and newly orphaned and alone in the world. Please send me someone who will not leave me alone. She had asked for one. She had been given 6. 7 if you counted God himself, who had started the whole thing moving with a single strange November afternoon in a sky gone the wrong color over the Bitterroot Range. Ophelia Holloway set the laundry basket down on the porch and went to her husband and her children. Rafferty shifted Samuel to make room for her on the bench. She sat down beside him and leaned her head against his shoulder, and the 4 of them sat in the sun and watched their family come home. Far off over the ridge, a crow flew from the top of one tall pine to another, just a black bird in a blue sky, now no longer a messenger of any kind. Rafferty looked out at the mountains. He spoke too quietly for anyone but Ophelia to hear. I used to think my life ended in a snowstorm, Ophelia. She turned her face up to him. And now I know my life began in one. She closed her eyes and smiled and pressed closer against his shoulder. And the sun went down slowly behind the Bitterroot Peaks, and Stone Creek Ranch lay under a gold light that was the color of grace, and the last page of the 23rd Psalm lay open on Rafferty Holloway's knee, where his thumb was resting on the final line. Surely goodness and mercy shall follow me all the days of my life, and I will dwell in the house of the Lord forever. The oath had been kept. The valley had been walked. And the storm that had started it all had in the end been the best thing that ever happened to the man who stood in his yard watching a purple sky come in over the mountains and felt against all his long and stubborn denial the whisper at the back of his neck that told him someone was out there and that someone needed him. He had gone out into the storm. He had brought her home, and home was what she had made of him in return.